Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. The Middle East is a dangerous place. There's a lot of sectarian violence, a lot of factions that we in the West don't necessarily understand, and often the best option is still a really bad option when it comes to governance, seeing who's in charge, who can keep the peace. One of the key cases of this is Syria. A lot of people recognize that Bashar al-Assad was not the nicest guy in the world, but a lot of people warn that if you knock that domino down, you would see a number of other ones fall that could create an even more dangerous situation. And now we're getting lots of videos coming out of Syria of violence against different religious minorities, especially Christians in that area. A lot of people are understandably upset and concerned, but it's very difficult to get a hold on what is happening there. So, talking to me today about this is Oliver from the Semiogogue YouTube channel. He is a very astute observer of foreign conflicts and someone who I regularly enjoy talking to. Oliver, thank you for joining me, man.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to get into this. Hopefully, we'll bring a little bit of light to a very difficult situation. But before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. Hey, everybody. This episode of the Auron MacIntyre Show is proudly sponsored by Consumers Research. You've heard about Larry Fink and BlackRock and ESG and all the ways that they're ruining your life, making grocery stores more expensive, making video games more woke. Well, Consumers Research has spent the last 5 years making Larry's life hell, and they're just getting started. Their work and its consequences have been profiled in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and most recently, Fox Business reporter Charlie Gasparino wrote a whole chapter in his book, Go Woke, Go Broke, on how effective they've been at dismantling BlackRock's ESG patronage scheme. He's making Larry Fink lose that last bit of hair on his balding head, and you should follow Will's work on X so you can laugh along with him. His handle is at WILLHILD. So give him a follow. Again, that's at WILLHILD on X. All right. So again, the situation in Syria is really ugly. If you've seen the videos online, they're horrific. I can't even play them here on YouTube. It'll instantly get us banned here. So you'll just have to trust us or search, search up those sources in your own time to see those videos if you want to. But it is very bad out there. And so, Oliver, for most people, they're just going to hear a country in the Middle East is, kind of descended into a sectarian war. Unfortunately, this is a scenario we have seen many, many times in that region, but specifically in Syria. Can you give people a little bit of context? Who are the groups? I know there are a lot of them. We don't have to get to all of them, but what are the major players in that region that are really creating the level of conflict we're seeing today?
Well, there are kind of two angles that we can approach that from. One angle is to look at the ethnic and sectarian diversity on the ground there, and that has some historical background, which perhaps I can tap on here. Then there is there are the different groups themselves that have emerged from that context that are, contributing to the fragmented nature of the country and the situation that they're facing there. So Syria, historically going far back, you can go back to the Hittites and the Egyptians, north and south of this region and the conflict of empires there. But more recently, you had the Ottoman Empire there, and the Ottoman Empire is, of course, Sunni. The majority of Muslims on earth are Sunni, but there are, of course, minority groups like the various flavors of Shia, and some of those get very strange, like the Druze and the Alawites in terms of their belief, which include things like reincarnation. The Alawites, for example, recognize a trinity. The Druze are more monotheistic. They're both very secretive in their beliefs. So there are all kinds of different groups there. There are Christians of various types. They're Orthodox, they're Maronites, and others, Catholics as well. There are Jews. There are the many different groups religiously. Then, of course, you've got the different ethnic groups. You've got Turkoman, you've got Circassians, groups from the Caucasus who relocated to this region. Turkoman meaning, Turkish groups in Syria. You've got the Sunnis, the Shia. As I said, it's a very mixed up situation. Armenians, Kurds. And so when the Ottomans arrived there, they had a system that was, we gloss it in the West as a millet system, a system of nations. And this system basically left a certain amount of control over affairs to the separate ethnic groups. And they each had their own religious leaders. So, in terms of taxes or military conscription and the rest, the Ottomans came in and, hammered everyone to get what they wanted. But in terms of how they handled things like civil disputes, to some extent, things having to do with property, marriage, inheritance, these different communities, these nations or millet, would be allowed to kind of take care of their own things under their religious leaders. And so I wanted to bring that up because you can already see that there's kind of a decentralization with these different communities. And in the absence of any kind of ethnic or religious uniformity across the territory, which only became a nation as we understand it roughly 100 years ago, you had people being forced to come together in their neighborhoods within a given city. So one neighborhood might be Armenian, another one might be Alawite, for example, or Kurdish, or you have a Kurdish or Alawite region, as we see with the northeastern portion of the country being under the control of U.S.-backed Kurdish forces, or the coastal regions where you've got the Russian air base and naval base, and a lot of the Christians and Alawites where there's violence right now. That was the coastal regions had more of the minorities. So you've got a background already for there to be considerable disunity, or as we should add, the opportunity to stick a lever into it to pry it apart based on the principle of, divide and conquer, or divide and rule. So
sorry to stop you there, but the phenomenon you're describing is so important, and it is so foreign to, I think, most people in the West, most modern people. I think it's worth taking a minute to just break it down. Not even the specifics of this, this scenario, but just the general idea you're discussing. So the millet system is one designed to allow an empire to rule many different peoples, or what were classically called nations. And today, most people think of nations as nation states, that the nation and the state, the nation and the country, are the same thing. But that's not been the case through much of human history. When a empire was ruling many different nations, ethnically diverse, religiously diverse, linguistically diverse peoples, really your only options were to go in and homogenize those regions, bring them under one understanding, or provide them a certain level of autonomy, allow them to keep their traditions, their religion, their language, but have them kick up to the empire, right? The Romans, in many cases, did this. It was varying degrees across their territories, but this is a very classic system, but it is very foreign to the current, I think, American or even European understanding of nations. And so I think this causes a lot of confusion, because people will say, oh, well, you'll hear the Western media say, oh, he's killing his own people in a country. And the answer is no, he's not. He doesn't see it that way. This leader does not see other peoples, other nations, as his nation. Just because they happen to be inside the state territory, the formal borders recognized by some international body somewhere, doesn't mean they are the same people sharing the same community and understanding. And that, I think, is very difficult for people, because so often in these highly diverse areas, the only way to hold them together is to have this overarching strong government or strong man, a dictator of some kind, who can cut through the differences between these peoples and give each one, at least their say in their area while still keeping a strong hand over them in general. It sounds brutal to a lot of people in the West, but in many ways, it's the only way to maintain that kind of equilibrium between the different nations, the different peoples inside an area. Uh, so yeah, I just wanted to stop and clarify that, because for a lot of people that might be the first time they've heard about that, or the understanding that dynamic. And I want the going into the discussion of these factions for people to grasp that this is how many areas of the world had been ordered previously. And when we shake that up, when we create this expectation of kind of modern states, we're often ignoring this dynamic that has a very historically robust kind of legacy throughout the existence of these areas.
Yes, and as I pointed out before, this can be a regional division. This can be a division in terms of a city. There's one city in particular that has the majority of the Circassians that live in Syria are in that one city. There are cities that are more associated with Alawites, more associated with a Sunni population. Or, as I said, it can come down to the to the level of neighborhoods where, people jealously guard their turf. And that is a very, very common thing across the Middle East. You have to think of it as along the lines of gangs of New York in terms of, perhaps that's a bit too lurid, but the basic idea is that they really resolutely defend their neighborhood. They're very territorial about it because it's the one place where they can exert some sort of territorial control within this framework. And, when a strongman does come along and impose some sort of order on it, it is very fragile. And the opportunities, as I said, for divide et impera, to divide and rule are many. So to come back all the way around to your question about, what sort of groups we have going on there. Well, as many people will know, the group currently in charge was most recently called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is, an organization that ultimately came out of al-Qaeda. Whatever al-Qaeda might be, that's something deeper to dig into. We probably don't have the scope for here, but basically they were considered under the name of al-Nusra Front to be a sort of Syrian affiliate of al-Qaeda. But over the years, they have changed their name many times. They've gone through a sort of mummer's farce of becoming more liberal, less conservative, less intolerant, these sorts of things. But the leader of Syria at this point is a guy who had the nom de guerre al-Jalani. He now goes by al-Shara, and he came out of al-Nusra Front and HTS. And he has considerable militia forces behind him. They are backed by Turkey. There is also another group, I believe it's the Free Syrian Army, which is backed by the Turks. And they operate more in the area of the northwest near the Turkish border. There are Kurdish forces, the YPG, and they make up the majority of what are called the Syrian Defense Forces. And these are backed by the United States. They control the primary food and energy producing regions of Syria. Once the United States got control there, they kept it in order to choke off the economics and energy situation and food for the Syrians in order to bring Assad down. You've got the Hezbollah, who came in order to back Assad while he was still in power during that period of civil war, that ran from, I believe, 2011 forward. Now, a lot of people would ask, well, why are the Turks backing one group? Why are the Iranians backing another group? And it all gets very, very complicated. But the Turks, who formerly governed there as the Ottomans, the artist formerly known as the Ottomans, they're Sunni, overwhelmingly majority Sunni. as is the population in Syria. And so they see that as the best way to deal with the situation. Now, Assad, who was in power, comes from the Alawite minority, and they are very loosely considered Shiites. But for your viewers, the real difference between Sunni and Shia is simply comes down to whether or not you believe that the community of believers should be led by caliphs who were chosen by the community in some respect, or its elites, or whether it should come down through bloodlines, which are people who were descended or allegedly descended from the prophet and are thought to carry some sort of mystical charge as a result of that, and they have more of an idea of prophet, not prophet, but well, we don't need to get into all of that. The basic idea is that that's the fundamental division, and how they have the joke about there's no Baptist sect too small not to schism again and yet again. That's what you see with the Shiites. So the Iranians are one branch of Shiites. The Alawites are another one, a very much smaller one. But given that situation where they're surrounded by this majority Sunni Muslim population, and in the Middle East, they tend to cleave together and to help each other out. And so Iran developed relationships with Assad, and in particular, in order to balance the situation with Israel. So
well, let's if we can, since you've mentioned him several times here, can we give a little background on Bashar al-Assad, because so much of the developments that have happened now obviously come with the toppling of his regime. Many people called for it over and over again, world leaders working for it, all kinds of sanctions, he saying, he's this guy using chemical weapons, wiping out his own people, all this kind of understandable, given some of the actions he took in there, hostility towards him. However, ultimately, people like Tulsi Gabbard, kind of warned that if you toppled Assad, as bad as he might be, that there would be very serious consequences. So can we just kind of work in who Assad was, where he came from, how he came to power, what his role was before he was deposed?
yes, well, we'd have to start with his father, if I have all of this straight in my mind. Basically, you had after World War One, you had the prior to the end of World War One and the armistice that was signed with the Turks, who were among the Central Powers. The Ottomans were ruling there, and then after this, you had the French and British mandates in the region as a result of, as many of our viewers will be aware, Mark Sykes and Monsieur Picot, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French and the British decided to divvy up that region. And then there was a period of French control, the French mandate, and then eventually the nation of Syria was recognized. And it was a sort of tumultuous period because it didn't have a foundation to be a nation. It's sort of like when you look at parts of the map in Africa, where you see these enormous straight lines, running, longitudinally or whatever. You can tell that that was a map drawn somewhere else by a European in order to create a nation, very often with sort of built-in perforations, so that if there was trouble of any kind in the future, they could stick a lever into it and split it apart, as we saw arguably in 2011. But so Syria was not a stable place. Eventually, this Ba'athist guy, Assad's father, I believe it's Hafez Assad, he comes in and establishes control. There were a series of coups. I believe that he came in and in the 70s and sort of established his power at that point. And he comes from the Alawite minority. And that, of course, was not appreciated by many of the different communities. The minorities basically came together around him and said, well, we'll throw in our lot because we minorities need to stick together against this overwhelming Sunni majority. But you were left with a Sunni majority in Syria that felt to some extent disenfranchised. Now, the country was relatively stable, certainly by the standards of the region, for quite some time. but Assad passed away, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the son that he had chosen to be the leader died, and that necessitated his second son having to be called in. Hopefully, I'm not mistaken here, and he was an eye doctor. And had spent quite a bit of time in Britain, so he was brought back to Syria in order to run the show as a member of that family. It had sort of de facto become a hereditary dictatorship, as it were. And not long after that, you saw the Arab Spring sweep through the region, and he was brought down. There was a sequence of events starting in 2011. You had protests. Many of our viewers will remember this. And, you had all sorts of violence in the streets and the rest. And then the government, began to wobble a bit, and armed groups were brought in. Many people say, and it seems quite evident, supported by the United States, in some cases via Turkey, but other Arab states were involved with this because they're Sunni and they don't have much tolerance for an Alawite-run government. Also, they're Baathists. So Baathists, it's a I don't want to get it all into it, but basically you've got groups of what amount to Arab national socialists. They come sort of on the model of Ataturk, establishing a republic as a transitional thing, the de-emphasis of Islam and Sharia at the level of government, protection of minorities, all of it being guaranteed by the military. That was sort of the standard. You'll see it with Nasser in Egypt. People will remember that sort of thing. So the Arab leaders have slowly been cutting out all the Baathists. All the remaining Baathists have been removed. The United States, of course, is central to this. Saddam Hussein was a Baathist. Assad was one of the last of them, if not the last of them. So he fell, and his country descended into chaos. Well, I have that not in quite the right order. His country descended into chaos. He was propped up by the Russians, and that went fairly well. But compared to how it could have gone, the issue
why were the Russians propping him up specifically? What was their interest in propping him up?
Well, you had the Suez Crisis in the 50s, and at that point, Russia began to get, or the Soviet Union, I should say, began to get more involved in the Middle East as a counterbalance there against the West, and out of concern for energy and regional opportunities and influence. And so they became an ally of Syria in that period, and they had investment. And indeed, Russia had historically gotten involved culturally, so to speak, in defending Orthodox communities in Syria. So there had been some history of that. But they were a Cold War ally, is the short answer. And so you had, during this period of the Arab Spring and the descent of Syria into greater and greater chaos, you ended up with a de facto partition of the country. And you had the Kurdish forces in the northeast. You had Turkish-backed forces that came down into Idlib. You have the Hezbollah forces that came over from Lebanon. You had Iranian forces there. So the country was sort of carved up into zones, the primary ones being the area where the Syrians with Russian support were able to carve out or to restore control. And that was primarily the coast and Damascus, and then eventually Aleppo. But the Kurdish, U.S.-backed Kurdish forces in the northeast, as I said, took control over the energy and the grain, the bread basket, essentially, of the country. And the Turks pushed down from the north into the area of Idlib and the rest. And it's a very complex picture because the Turks are concerned about the Kurds and fighting with them, but backing militants who are going after the government in Damascus. Um, and then you have the Iranians and the Russians and the remnants of the Syrian government cooperating in order to hold all of these people at bay.
So, what ultimately drove um, Western governments to want to see the fall of Bashar al-Assad? Was it just his relationship with Russia? What was the overarching desire? I mean, if he's a guy who's at least to some extent providing, a some kind of guidance in a region that otherwise is going to just be a mess no matter what. I mean, what drove people to want to see that mix up? What, I think you mentioned Israel, the United States, other, Turkey, who all were involved and wanted to see him go, and what specifically was their motivation?
Well, here you get into a realm of speculation. So I can make no claims that all of my speculation is accurate. The safe answer is to say Assad was a bad, bad man, and he was a dictator. And so he needed to be brought down in order to make the world safe for democracy. That still
I've
is
heard that one before. I've heard that before.
yes,
Yes.
that is the official answer.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to turn to some of the speculative answers, there are many different flavors and explanations. One of them is that the Qataris had wanted to put a pipeline in that would cross this territory, and Assad wanted to be cut in on it more than they thought he deserved, or some such. You will hear that Erdogan in Turkey is presiding over a resurgent neo-Ottoman project, and so he wants to reassert his influence in areas that were historically under the control of the Turks. You will certainly hear that about things like Greater Israel and the Yinon Plan, and the idea that Syria had to be brought down as this major enemy of Israel, part of this group, that is called the Resistance, which is a rather odd one because you have Hamas, which is a primary, well, the majority of them are Sunni Arabs, but you also have Christians and others who are, Arabs who are, Palestinians. But then you have the Syrian state, which is a sort of a national socialist state run by an Alawite minority. And then you have Lebanon, which is, also a sectarian mess, with Shiite Hezbollah. And then you have the 12 are Shiites in Iran. So that axis had to be broken from an Israeli perspective, and quite dramatically. Just at the end of last year, that happened when the forces that had been backed by Turkey that were bottled up in Idlib came marching out. And it seemed very strangely that the Syrian army, such as it was, just crumpled before the advance of these forces, almost inexplicably. And Assad fled to Russia and left behind his Alawite co-religionists. We are told that his wife was dying of cancer, which, you can imagine that that would distract a man. So, yes, but I'm getting ahead of the primary question. It seems that there was a project to remake the Middle East, and that different parties and players involved in that had different motivations. One last motivation that should be mentioned is a considerable offshore reserves of natural gas, and there is also quite a bit of oil in Syria. Now, Syria is not a major energy player. Of course, it's been offline. It's been choked, by sanctions and the rest for quite some time. So it's not operating at full efficiency, certainly. But were its energy resources to be fully exploited, you would see, they probably got 1/100th of the oil that Saudi Arabia does, probably 1/10 of the natural gas that Saudi Arabia does. But it's still, these are still resources that are certainly could be valued in the billions. Um, but as I started to say, there's a considerable offshore natural gas, which is only has been only which was more recently discovered and only recently has begun to be exploited properly, primarily by Israel. Lebanon, there are some disputes with Lebanon regarding the territorial waters and whose resources are where, between the Lebanese and the Israelis. But there's also quite a bit in the way of resources off of the coast of Syria. And Russia intervened there, I believe, in order to keep its seat at the table, to keep its ports there, of course, and its airbase. But there is going to be considerable energy development there. And when Russia intervened, this was prior to the war in Ukraine breaking out. This was prior to the energy being shut off, that formerly had flowed to Europe. So Russia, was concerned to keep a seat at the table in terms of that energy as well, because if there were major energy developments there that they didn't have a piece of, that would cut a major chunk out of their revenue that had been coming from Europe at that time. So you have a very complex game going on off the coast of Syria, which involves the Turks, who everyone should remember have controlled northern Cyprus since 74, I believe. And the Turks have a strong interest in becoming an energy hub for Europe. Excuse me. And so they're interested in that respect. I think the Israelis are interested. The Israelis were set to begin energy export project to Europe sometime back during the prior Trump administration. And you saw some strangeness with Turkey and Libya saying that they wanted to that they would not permit any kind of pipelines to run across the Mediterranean through what they called their territorial waters. And everybody got quite excited about all of it. The Turks were sending prospecting ships down into the Mediterranean and saying that they would have to have a piece of this pie. And then Biden came into office and shut down the project to export Israeli gas to Europe. Now that it was not operating, but it was planned, and Biden shut that program down. I'm probably winding too far afield here, but the point is that there's a dimension of this which involves serious energy plays that will affect the energy future and energy security of Europe. And at the time of the Russian intervention, I suspect this was a part of their calculus as well, to remain a part of this picture.
Yeah, it sounds like Syria really was just a disaster waiting to happen, or was already happening and continues to happen. You have a country that is inherently unstable due to the artificial divides that were kind of introduced when it was created. It already had a political instability, a politically unstable structure with many different factions vying for control. On top of this, you have several different major power players, all interested in different, geopolitical concerns, energy concerns, financial concerns, all getting involved. You have the United States funding some groups, Russia, Turkey, Israel, other Middle Eastern nations. It's just a mess in every single possible sense that one could imagine. And that's why I kind of started this by saying sometimes there are no good options. We like to kind of stare at these scenarios and just be like, okay, you take the George Washington of Syria and you just put him in charge of all the Syrians, and then you get the United States of Syria, right? Like, and that we often kind of treat political situations as if that is kind of how these things unfold. But the truth is that through a long list of these, different feuds, these different linguistic and tribal, ethnic, religious factionalism, on top of great power politics, money, military, all this stuff flowing in and out, this is always going to be a cluster, no matter what it feels like. So Bashar al-Assad is gone. A lot of people are seeing the aftermath. I guess I can ask you the dumb question, and then hopefully move to maybe the more nuanced question. The dumb question is it any better, or is it any worse, or is that even something we could determine? kind of post Bashar al-Assad's fall? Is it less stable, more stable, or just a different type of instability? And then on top of that, what are the dynamics inside New Syria? What are the major players there? Who's in charge now? What are their interests? Who are they tied to?
Okay. Well, yes.
Start wherever
Uh,
you want with that long list of complicated things.
oh, no worries. Well, I just wanted to add one other thing that makes this a recipe, or has made it a recipe for disaster, is that each of these different um, each of these different countries that has intervened through history, or the empire in the case of the Ottomans, they each went to a particular population and worked with that population. And the other populations, of course, remember. So, the majority Sunni Arabs remember the French coming in and helping out the Christians and the Alawites, right? The minority populations remember the Ottomans coming in, right? So, or Russians helping out the Orthodox population, or people thinking about how the Druze have relatively good relations with the Israelis, or in some cases, because a lot of these things break down by tribe and clan affiliation as well. So that's just another aspect of resentment and simmering, dissatisfaction that was unleashed with all of this. In terms of whether or not it's better, I'm not a Syrian. And while I lived in the region for 6 years, right nearby in Turkey, I've never been to Syria. But I can say that following the different people who uh, discuss such things, one of whom is Kevork Almasian, Syriana analysis. If anyone is interested, his information is good, but of course it's very colored. He has his own take. I'm not endorsing all of that, but he's about the best source of information if you're prepared to understand those biases that's out there in English. I believe he's an Armenian living in Germany, but he's from Syria and follows the situation pretty closely. So, for example, if you listen to someone like him talk about it, um, under the Ba'athist regime of the Assads, they didn't want trouble. They wanted trouble shut down, and they hammered it where they could when they found out about it. Um, so you hear about these people being raised in a more or less secular situation, at least from the perspective of the government, because they had so many communities. So, one video I was watching recently, the guy who was a Syrian Christian was talking to an Armenian Syrian Christian, and they were discussing how, they could finish up their sports practice at the end of the day and drink some water even during Ramadan. Now, of course, for the Muslims, you're not supposed to have anything pass your lips during the period of fast, from sunrise to sunset during the day. And, he would say that, yeah, there would be Muslims there. They couldn't drink after the sports practice, but he would drink water and there wouldn't be a problem. Whereas now they have Turkmen militia or whatever, or Tajiks or whatever, marching through the streets, keeping order in Syria today, and giving people a very hard time, or threatening them with violence, or engaging in violence with them if they see them breaking their fast during the period of Ramadan. That's another point that I should have made earlier. Many of these Turkish-backed fighters, they're essentially mercenary forces that have been brought in from many other places. So the Syrians already have a very mixed population, as we've discussed, but many of these Turkish fighters, they're from Tajikistan, they're from Kazakhstan, they're Uyghurs. So you have an even more sort of international force with its own groupings and affiliations, because these are all tribal peoples. So even if you bring them in as a Turkish-backed force, they're going to sort of clump up in their own ways with their own interests under their own leaders in their own territories and start to play the game that they always play.
Making the
So it's
Spanish
very
Civil War look pretty simple by comparison here. But yeah, sorry, go on.
yeah, actually, in terms of, I don't know, the Spanish Civil War is pretty crazy, but yeah. So my impression is that it's not just worse, but very, very much worse. And I don't recommend that people unless you have a very strong stomach and don't mind seeing violence and death, not pretend. I don't recommend that people go and watch these videos, but the videos that have been circulating showing the violence that's going on in the coastal regions, they suggest very strongly that it's not better. Now, there is perhaps some hope in the future for the situation to improve, certainly economically. Right as this violence was going on the coast, and I should say it's not clear what's happening there. Somebody like what's her name, the foreign minister now in the EU, who comes from one of the Baltic, Kaya Kallas, I want to say, she put out a tweet saying that the violence was being perpetrated by pro-Assad forces. Assad left. He fled, and he left his fellow Alawites to hold the bag. I don't think there are any pro-Assad forces there.
Yeah.
There are Alawites who are concerned about their future, who have fled, for example, to Russian bases in order not to be killed in the streets. It's not clear what happened there. The claim on the part of the people on the coast, I'm sorry, the claim regarding the situation on the coast made by the people in power is that pro-Assad militias have been attacking people and they had to go and restore order. And of course, there was violence. But there's violence, and it's bad. And lots of people are being killed, men, women, children. So it's a very bad scene. It seems that there is some hope for the future, but it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. At the time that violence was going on, because it now has wound down considerably, at this moment, I believe Britain lifted its sanctions right as this violence was going on the coast with the killing of minorities. Britain lifted its economic sanctions. If that's my understanding, and you just had a major agreement signed. One of the big questions about what's going to happen in the future, what the situation, how the situation is going to unfold. The big question has to do with these Turkish-backed forces who've seized control. They're Sunni, right? And the Turks have a big problem with the Kurds. So you have, and have had for quite some time, fighting between Turkish-backed forces and US-backed Kurdish forces, which has always been kind of a head-scratcher because you've got these two NATO countries who are, engaged in a conflict by proxy. So one of the big questions has been, well, how is that going to get worked out? And what's the picture for the future of Syria? Because if the Kurds aren't driven out, then you've got a problem because they control the energy and the farmland. But if you go after them to try to drive them out, then Turkey and the United States are more at odds. So everybody's been wondering what's going to happen. And there has been violence up until just a few days ago, ongoing violence. This is sort of attacks by Turkish-backed forces against the SDF, or primarily Kurdish coalition forces. And they've been going at it around Manbij and in some other places. So just here on the 10th, there was so just 2 days ago, you find my list of what's covered in it. There was an agreement. This was signed between the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian National Army, which is now controlled by these HTS guys and the rest, who are Turkish-backed. So this was signed, as I said, March 10th, and it basically covers a number of points. One, and I'm pulling this, Kevork Almasyan talked about this recently on his channel. It's most of the resources out there don't go into all of the points that were signed. He speaks Arabic, of course, and summarize them. So I'm pulling this list from him. The first point is there's a guarantee of equal rights. All Syrians have a right to representation and participation in the political process and inclusion in state institutions, irrespective of their religious or ethnic background. Now, this is, coming right on the heels of minorities being killed on the coast, of course.
Right.
Number two, recognition of the Kurdish community with full citizenship, that they're an integral part of the state, their rights are guaranteed. So that makes it seem like they're avoiding a partition. They call for a full national ceasefire. So you can imagine if only 2 days ago there was a document signed between the Kurds and the new government that they're calling for a full national ceasefire as of 2 days ago. It's probably not that stable there. The fourth point was integration of civilian and military structures under state administration, safe return of displaced Syrians, ensure a safe return with state protection, and they call for defense and security coordination. They say to combat Assad's militias. Again, Assad left. I don't think he's popular among any of the Alawites at this point. And lastly, rejection of division and hate speech, all forms of sectarianism, ethnic division, and incitement of violence and hatred. And all of this is, in theory, supposed to be implemented by the end of 2025. Whether or not that's going to happen, I don't know. Some of the analysts are saying that HTS al-Jilani, now called al-Shara, the new government, that they were forced to sign this agreement because of what's going on the coast, that they would very likely otherwise want to get more out of the deal that would need to be made with the Kurds than they're getting here, if any of this holds. But the suggestion is that they need to stop fighting each other in order to deal with the instability on the coast now. So that should provide some sort of picture of, whether I think it's better now. It certainly doesn't seem to be. It seems to be awful, though it's been awful for years. And the United States probably played the leading role in imposing all of this, whether covertly through, intelligence games and bringing in mercenary forces, or things like Operation Timber Sycamore, delivering weapons so that, you've got plenty of sparks to make the gas, go up in flames, or overtly through sanctions. And onerous sanctions have been placed on Syria for quite some time. People talk about how, military officers were making like $7 a month at the time that those militants came marching out of Idlib and took over the government. So it's been a terrible situation. As for the future, the speculation is that something is going to be worked out between the United States, Russia, and Israel. One of the big questions after all this went down was whether or not the Russians were going to keep their air base at Hmeimim, I believe it is. Anyway, on the coast, there's a major air base, and there is also a port, the only one that I'm aware of that Russia has at present in the Mediterranean, and for repairs and refueling and supply. The question was whether they were going to be able to keep those. And it seemed like they would very likely be pushed out. Oddly enough, that hasn't happened. Turkey apparently must be willing to have them stay there, which makes sense because the Turks are developing themselves as an energy hub. They're a Black Sea neighbor of Russia. They actually, despite NATO and posturing and the conflict in Syria, the Turks want to maintain good relations with Russia. So there's that. The Israelis have also apparently called for the Russians to stay because they want another player there to stabilize things, or at least to have another center of gravity in a place that's as fractious and disunited as Syria. There's also aspects of the energy game going on there as well, because without Russia there, having something to do with developing the offshore resources of Syria, Turkey would have a much stronger hand because they're right there, both with the southern projecting part of the country right there, the former Sanjak of Alexandretta, as well as the North Cyprus. Northern Cyprus. It puts them in a very good position to, for example, having offshore gas liquefaction facilities, really get involved in that. And I believe in the future, Israel is going to want to do quite a bit more of that, because if they can develop their energy resources, then they're in a situation where, they don't have to, they don't suffer from the insecurity, the fear of having their energy supplies cut off, and at the same time they gain a lucrative export. So it seems that something is going to be worked out along those lines in future. Perhaps this business of the agreement that was signed between the new government and the Kurds is a signal that that's on the horizon.
Yeah, it's as you've laid out here in quite a bit of detail and still have only really touched the tip of that iceberg. It's a very complicated situation, one that unfortunately sounds like it's not going to see rapid improvement, and is going to continue to be playground of greater powers for quite a long time. So no immediate solutions here, but I think a good primer for many people who were probably not aware of the dynamics there, the level of complexity, the different players involved. So definitely very grateful for you coming on and breaking that down for us, Oliver. We've got a few questions from the audience. Before we get to them, can you tell people where to find your work? Is there any project coming up that you want to make people aware of?
No specific projects coming up, but you can find me on my channel on YouTube. It's called Semiogogue. It's also mirrored to BitChute and Odyssey and places like this. And also, you can find me on Twitter, or X, sorry, where I'm
It's
also
Twitter.
on
We
the
just
same
call
name. Twitter, indeed. And I should add, keep your eyes on the horizon for the possibility of partition, because what's happened is a de facto partition. A lot of people say, well, it might be partitioned in the future. It's partitioned now,
it.
and it serves certainly Israel's interests, probably a number of other countries in the region's interest for it to be parceled out. And the Turks would very likely want a piece of it. The Kurds want their own autonomous region. So just a last thing to throw in there. Yes.
Yeah, no, again, it's the political realities on the ground and the things that are willing to be acknowledged by the wider international community can be very different. So it may be technically a country somewhere, but as you point out, already experiencing those partitions and forces may only drive it more in that direction. All right, Mongoose here says a real multiculturalism on full display. Very much so, very much so. And this is something that I think it becomes increasingly important. The question of what is America is starting to pop up quite a bit now. And as we address that, I think having a long historical view of nationhood, identity, the differentiation between nation and state, the dynamics that might be in play there are all very critical. Understanding there's a reason that many political thinkers throughout history were not a fan of multiculturalism, because it usually leads, unfortunately, to really terrible outcomes, as we're seeing now. So, yeah, it turns out diversity not so much the strength in Syria or anywhere else.
Yeah,
Let's see
it
here.
creates essentially no-go zones.
Yep.
The millet aspect I was talking about, where you have certain cities or regions or even neighborhoods. The result of sort of deterritorialization at the level of the nation state is an attempt to reimpose it wherever one can, whether that's Puerto Ricans and Irish, fighting over turf, or Muslims in Malmo, Sweden, or Rotherham. You have these places that become, well, it's balkanization. It really is. And so that aspect of the millet is one that bears thinking about. I hope more people on our side of things will consider it. I did a video with Apostolic Majesty. He's got a channel going into history and the rest, where we look at this idea of imperial diversity and these populations. For those of you out there who are interested in digging into the history of it, going back to the Ottoman period and the rest, I recommend that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at the American experience and they're like, well, my Dutch ancestors moved over here, and then these Germanic, ancestors moved over here in the United States, and they didn't start knife fighting each other, so it'll all work out, right? We can just move everyone from everywhere in here, and as long as they raise their hand and they give the oath of allegiance 5 years after touching the soil, everything will be fine, and there won't be any problems. And they don't recognize the very dangerous game that you're playing by setting up these ethnic enclaves across your country. You're right to point out that this is something we're seeing in the UK, we're seeing it in Sweden, we're seeing it all over. And people who are running around being like, we're a propositional nation, we're different, we just get people to believe the same thing and it solves these problems. They're playing a very dangerous game. Just to be really frank, like they are playing with the future of their children. They're playing with the future of their religion. They're playing with the future of their people. Uh, you know, trying to blind themselves to this reality of kind of the human dynamic. Uh, Count Artha says, people in nation states think democracy and freedom are the same thing, but if you are surrounded by hostile majorities, democracy feels like tyranny. Yeah, and again, this was Lee Kuan Yew's point about democracy, right? When you have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, you don't vote principles or abstract ideas. You vote your religion and you vote your race, right? And that's unfortunately when a lot of people walk around and they're just like, well, we'll give democracy, and that generates self-determination. Well, when you hand self-determination over to a bunch of people who are involved in ethnic tribal conflict, guess what they determine? They should get rid of the other guy, right? They should be able to rule over, oppress, pillage, rape, and destroy the other guy. And so in many of these nations, handing them democracy as we understand it doesn't generate freedom. It generates a looting phase in which one minority or one majority figures out how to kind of rule over or destroy the others. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Of course, you should most certainly be checking out Oliver's work. Also, if it's your first time here, make sure that you are subscribing to this YouTube channel. Click the bell, notifications, all that stuff when we go live. Obviously, there's an attack on X yesterday, on Twitter yesterday. And so we were not live there, but we're back up today. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you would like to support the show, you can head over to blazemedia.com, click on the Auron MacIntyre collection, and there's merch there for you to pick up. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.